I am going to talk a little bit.
Here, I'm just going to do this.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. I'm going to talk a little bit more expansively about gay life in Greenwich Village in the 1950s and 1960s, and sort of think about some of the preconditions for gay liberation, the 10 or 20 years that transpired before the Stonewall riots, which you read about before today. And I want to think about this in terms of the economy, which is a little bit unusual way to think about LGBT politics. But I think the economy is kind of important and in some ways interesting, just reflecting on my own experiences, because when you come out, some of the first things you start to worry about are, the basic things like how to get a job, where you're going to find an employer who's going to accept you for your sexual orientation or your gender identity, and also, where you can go out in public spaces as an openly LGBT person. So to some extent, this is, about going to bars, right? And so I think when I think about the economy, I actually think more about the economic exchanges that take place within gay culture, in some of the economic institutions at the center of gay cultural life. So it's not a huge stretch to think about gay bars as a kind of market. And it's certainly not a stretch to think about it, gay bars as the center of gay and lesbian life in the 1950s and 1960s. And specifically, I want to talk about lesbian bars and talk about lesbian consumers. So, I realize I'm sort of walking on thin ice because I don't want to say that gay liberation is a kind of consumer ideology. I don't want to say that it's just about being able to buy and sell certain kinds of products or getting a job. In a lot of ways, these economic exchanges have much deeper meaning for the people that are participating in them. So, lesbian life in particular sort of has this articulation of a consumer economy. If you look at the poetry, lesbian poetry from the 1960s and 1970s, there are lots of references to consumer products, and especially to men's beauty products, things like Old Spice and Hanes, certain brands of perfume. So already these objects, which may seem kind of banal, or kind of alien, something that you can just get at a local Walgreens, are actually quite meaningful and quite important to the people that are purchasing them and appropriating them for the purposes of building a kind of unique culture, a unique lesbian culture. The only other context for gay and lesbian life in the 1950s and 1960s is really prisons and insane asylums, psychiatrists' offices, places where gays and lesbians are confronting an identity that is really pathological, that's really criminalized. So the economy is kind of an important place to remake an identity that is not pathological, that is not about being sick, or that is not about being a criminal. And in the 1950s and 1960s, the situation, the legal situation for gay men and lesbians is very complicated. You're still very much subject to arrest. In some ways, the bar scene is not necessarily about sort of the supply and demand of consumer goods, the way that we would conventionally think about them. The only good that's being exchanged in a bar is a drink, unless you count the price of admission or the entrance fee. In some ways, it's about forging relationships. It's about forging friendships, which are probably the most important relationships that are developed in the context of these bars. It's also important for forging romantic and erotic relationships. And it's also important for forging enmity as well, which is also important. So you can't have the good without the bad. And in some ways, what emerges from this scene is a very complex picture of love and hate. It's a very human kind of experience. And so that's what I'm going to be thinking about today when we're talking about lesbian bars. And I want to share a quote with you from Joan Nessel, who you read about today. She was talking about lesbian bars in the 1950s and 1960s when giving an interview. And she says, I grew up, or I came out, in a community that was the most oppressed and also the most resilient, the most courageous. So my sense of who we were was a tremendously brave people who created worlds with very little. And in some ways, her quote gives you kind of an image of how constrained gay life is in the 1950s and 1960s. And that's what you read about whenever you think about Stonewall and you think about why LGBT consumers, bargoers riot. After the police raid Stonewall Bar on June 28th, 1969. But in some ways, it also shows you that this space, this closet economy in the 1950s and 1960s that is taking shape in gay bars is also a site of liberation. It's really the only site where you see any kind of significant LGBT community. And in some ways, these are where the political ideas that will spill out of the 1970s are first encountered by LGBT people. So I want to think about the economy in a couple of different ways. And the first way that I want to think about this is in terms of the cultural and legal institutions that define gay life. All economies are subject to certain kinds of institutional rules and regulations. In a free market economy, in a sort of economically liberal society, supposedly, as long as you have the money, you should be able to freely spend it however you want it, right? Or at least this is kind of what we learn from our culture. But in a gay and lesbian economy in the 1950s and the 1960s, this isn't really true. To some extent, part of this is driven by popular culture. Even though we are free to purchase some goods, we also may be stigmatized for purchasing them or stigmatized for patronizing certain institutions, which is what happens with gays and lesbians in the 1950s and 1960s. So many of the people who are going to these bars are going there knowing that if they get caught, if they see somebody that recognizes them, that their lives, their social lives could be very much in danger. It could mean a loss of job. It could mean loss of housing. It could also mean loss of friendships, social ostracism, loss of familial bonds. And in fact, we have lots and lots of evidence that in the 1950s and 1960s, this is exactly what happened to lesbian and gay bargoers who were found out. And so popular culture is probably the most important institutional constraint on gay life in the 1950s and 1960s. The other aspect of sort of the institutionality of gay and lesbian markets in the 50s and 60s is the law. And the law is kind of complicated. In some ways, lesbians are not subject to the same kinds of laws that gay men are. If I could read you, let me see, just a short passage from Anne Aldrich's We Walk Alone, which is a 1955 book about lesbian life. She says, a Greenwich Village lesbian I know who dresses exclusively as a butch told me she was bothered by the police only a few times, even though on a summer night in Washington Square, plenty goes on the grass and the coppers know it. The few times a policeman did stop her, it was not to arrest her, but instead to force her into an empty garage where he insisted she strip down before him while he examined her entire body for heroin capsules and marijuana cigarettes. He only did it to butches, she said. Butches are sort of masculine appearing lesbians, right? He must have got some kind of big kick out of it. If we tried to resist him, he'd say he'd turn and say that we were found in the act and we get our names on the record books. We didn't have any choice, but most of them let us alone. The fags are the one they want. Fags make more trouble, women are quieter, and they don't want to start fights or squeal around in the streets after straight people. So what you see with lesbians anyway is that they're sort of being terrorized by the police, but they don't have any official legal reason to do it. And in fact, we have lots of reports and lots of evidence that gay women in the 1950s and 1960s are often sexually assaulted by police. Sometimes the strip search doesn't just stop at a strip search. And so the kinds of sexual violence that lesbians are subject to is something that gay men certainly are not having to deal with. On the other hand, there are pretty strong legal restrictions around gay male activity. Gay men are covered by the New York State sodomy statute, which means sexual activity between gay men, consenting adults, is completely criminalized. This means if you socialize in a gay bar with the intent to commit this act, you are also in violation of the law. And the State Liquor Authority, which is kind of the legal institution that governs bars in New York City, is basically on the lookout for gay male bars, but lesbian bars are kind of invisible in some ways. So, the major institutional constraints around gay life really tend to be about popular culture and sort of the ways in which lesbians and gays are viewed at the time. So another way to think about the economy and culture in the 1950s and 1960s is by thinking about information. How do you access these spaces if they're hidden off? If they don't have, rainbow insignia in the doorways, this is not a post-gay liberation world. There are no recognizable signs or brands that indicate where lesbian and gay bars are. So how do you find this stuff out, particularly if you don't live in New York City? The answer to that is complicated, but one of the ways that we think about this is through gossip, through kind of word-of-mouth networks, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And the other way is you start to see the publication of books by and for lesbians and gay men in the 1950s and 1960s. And while most of those don't give you any specific references to names of bars or any information about the bars, like how much it costs to get in, whether or not the bar is run under the auspices of the local mafia, whether or not the drinks are watered down or the bartenders are friendly, all of this kind of information is absent from the literature. But what you do see over and over is the repetition of names of certain neighborhoods, and especially Greenwich Village. So that by the end of the 1940s, really, Greenwich Village is already kind of shorthand for the most recognizably gay neighborhood in the United States. There's actually a book that comes out that's not by a gay man or lesbian. It comes out in 1948, and it's called New York Confidential, by two gossip columnists, Jack Late and Lee Mortimer. And their chapter on Greenwich Village is called Where Men Wear Lace Lingerie. It describes lesbian and gay life in pretty significant and very lurid kinds of detail. Already in 1948, this book, which is a national seller and lots of people are reading, is kind of giving the American reading public, people that wouldn't have access to this kind of information, a little bit of insight as to where they might find these mythical gay and lesbian bars. So the sources for this are really hard to come by, and I've been doing some detective work for about 4 or 5 years now. Most important sources are through the Lesbian History Archive in New York Public Library, which has some pretty extensive holdings in LGBT life. Even those are pretty scanty. This is from the Lesbian History Archive's file on lesbian bars. And Joan Nessel, who you read before today, was the founder of the Lesbian History Archive. And it basically grew out of a collection that she started putting together in the 1970s in her apartment. And it eventually grew into one of the largest libraries, sort of private archives in the city. It's located down in Park Slope in Brooklyn. She was putting together a list of these bars and trying to figure out where they were. Well, there are no bar guides in the 1950s and 1960s. And you get the first bar guide that talks about New York City bars in 1964. And it's written by a gay man, who lives in, his name is Guy Straight, believe it or not. He lives in, I think it's a pseudonym. But he's writing out of San Francisco at the time, and he's not really paying attention to lesbian life. And so some of the bar listings for lesbian bars, and this is just by comparing with my own research, are off. Sometimes it gives you the neighborhood. So the Sea Colony, which is probably the biggest and longest lived lesbian bar in the 50s and 60s, is just listed at being at Abingdon Square, which is not that big. It's fairly easy to find. But the Sea Colony is actually listed twice in this as the Sea Colony and the Colony. So anyway, long story short, there's no way to just compile an exhaustive list, a kind of directory of lesbian bars. And of course, you can't open up the yellow pages from the 50s and 60s and find out where the lesbian bars are. So Joan Nessel and her staff at the LHA started sending out questionnaires to their members in the early 1980s saying, do you remember this lesbian bar? Or do you remember that lesbian bar? You know, we're trying to put together a list of names. And so she got correspondence over a couple of years, but even with that, all she was able to put together is on this one memo. And this basically represents a list of all the lesbian bars in New York City from 1930s to the 1970s. And I've been able to compile a few more lists from other sources. This is the typed view. But you can see it's very small. It's a very limited number of bars. And you know, even in hindsight, even asking people who are out of the closet, who live in a post-Stonewall world, it's difficult to get information on these bars. So what I know about this subject is really the tip of the iceberg, I think. And I keep hoping that I'm going to stumble on a mother lode of somebody who's just documented very painstakingly lesbian life. But so far I haven't come across it. So one of the things I've been doing the last few years is supplementing by scouring memoirs of the 1950s and 1960s, and also scouring interviews that were conducted since the 1980s of lesbians and gay men who lived and played and worked in Greenwich Village in the 50s and 60s. And you know, this involves going through every page and looking for the name of a bar and seeing if there's an address and writing it down. And so I was able to sort of come up with about a half dozen more. And you know, some of the memoirs I'm going to talk about today are Audre Lorde's Zamie, Joan Nessel's writings, and Joan Nessel and Audre Lorde probably have the most complete accounts of what life is like inside these bars, and also Mary Jane Meeker, who is an author who moves to New York City from Missouri in the 1950s, basically so that she can live a lesbian life. And she begins her career as an editor for Gold Medal Publishing, which is a kind of pulp fiction publishing press, and then eventually goes on to write a number of lesbian novels, which are, you know, really the first lesbian novels written by lesbians. There are a lot of lesbian novels in the 1950s. They're big sellers, but they're mostly written by straight men, and they're mostly written for, you know, purposes of pornography. You know, it's basically erotic fiction. So when Mary Jane Meeker starts writing, she's writing, you know, about, you know, the more emotionally complex world that lesbians inhabit. And she publishes under a dozen pseudonyms, and one of the pseudonyms is Anne Aldrich. And these are, you know, some of the first nonfiction accounts that we have of lesbian life in the 1950s. And the first one, called We Walk Alone, appears in 1955. In its sequel, We Too Must Love, you know, which is kind of shows a sort of desire for partnership, for love, is published in 1958. And both of these books are peppered with references to Greenwich Village, and there are lots of names of bars, but they're all basically fictionalized accounts of real bars that actually exist. So this is another major source that I've been using to kind of think about where lesbian bars are and what lesbian life is like. And another major source is a writer that Mary Jane Meeker discovered, a woman who was a Philadelphia housewife in the 1950s, who was also an immigrant from the Midwest. She had met her husband at the University of Illinois, and they had 2 kids and got a job in Philly, and they moved up the main line, and she was living a life that, you know, sounds a lot like Betty Friedan's description of the feminine mystique in 1963. So she begins reading these lesbian novels written by Vin Packer, which is one of Mary Jane Meeker's pseudonyms. And so she writes to Mary Jane Meeker and she says, you know, I would like to meet you. I'd like to start writing my own lesbian novels. I have this draft. She starts sending her materials. And eventually, while her husband is away and while her kids are at the sitters, she starts sneaking away during the day, you know, riding New Jersey Transit up to New York City, where she meets Meeker, and they go out and they kind of explore Greenwich Village. And eventually Ann Weldy publishes a series under the name Ann Bannon called the Bebo Brinker series, which is in print, by the way, and it's a wonderful series of books that has some great fictional descriptions of Greenwich Village life. And Weldy's memoirs and also her novels have become kind of an important source of thinking about lesbian bars in the 1950s and 60s, and also the kinds of economic circumstances that lesbians face when they're coming out in the village in the 1960s. So one of her great books, Bebo Brinker, which is kind of the prequel to the whole series, the first chapter is all about the main character moving from a small town in the Midwest, and all she wants is a place where she can get a job where she can wear pants. And this seems very trivial. It seems kind of unimportant. But for Bebo Brinker, for the main character, it's the only way that she can sort of feel like who she is. She's sort of chased out of her hometown because she's a tomboy. And so Greenwich Village offers this huge opportunity for her just because she can get a job where she's wearing pants. This is incredibly meaningful to the main character. So all of these sources are sort of saturated with descriptions of sort of economic life. So kind of moving on a little bit, thinking about this kind of information, it occurs to me that there are two basic ways that you can access these lesbian bars. So the first way is obviously person-to-person contact. So you need somebody to kind of initiate you, and you need a guide in order to access these spaces in the 1950s and 1960s. This is the kind of relationship that Anne Weldy develops with Mary Jane Meeker. Meeker basically introduces her to the lesbian bars that are quote-unquote safe. And I'll describe the bars in a minute, but not all of them certainly were, especially for a relatively innocent Philadelphia housewife who doesn't know the ways of the city. This in turn kind of creates a literature about Greenwich Village in the 1950s. So when Anne Weldy publishes Bebo Brinker many years later, she says, basically what I felt like I was doing is writing guidebooks for people who were like me, people who were out in the suburbs or out in the hinterland, people who wanted to know that there was a lesbian life that existed in places like New York City. As a result of this kind of reading public that's cultivated by Gold Medal and other publishers, more and more people become exposed to this idea that Greenwich Village might offer the opportunity to live the kind of life that you want. And so as a result, we have lots and lots of memoirs, and this is all anecdotal evidence. We don't have a whole lot of census data on LGBT people prior to 1990, really prior to 2010. So we don't know, what percentage of the population in Greenwich Village is gay or lesbian, kind of going from decade to decade. But there's lots of anecdotal evidence that gay men and lesbians, and especially gay men who have a little bit more money, more access to economic privileges of job preferences and things like that. But we have lots of evidence that these folks are moving in from the suburbs, from places like Texas and Nebraska. In some ways, I'm sort of part of that wave of migration. Although at the very end of it, I moved from a small town in West Texas. So a lot of these descriptions seem very familiar to me, especially because West Texas is in many ways still stuck in the 1950s and 1960s. This kind of brings in a gay migration in the 1950s and 1960s, and sort of contributes to a kind of critical mass. And in some ways, you see this critical mass erupt after Stonewall. You see how large numbers of people can be very powerful in terms of fighting back against the police, mafia exploitation, that kind of thing. So information is really, really important in terms of growing this community. It provides a kind of practical primer to what's in the village as well. By the end of the 1960s, you have gay guides that are being published by gay men, but they mention lesbian bars, and they describe, what the atmosphere is like, whether or not the owners are being exploitative, whether or not the police are raiding the bars on a regular basis. All of those kinds of pieces of information that are just very kind of practical guides to going into the village. The other aspect of information is much more ideological. It's all about affirming lesbian and gay life. This is the only literature, this is the only published literature anyway, that's not describing LGBT people basically as monsters or criminals or sick people, either objects of pity or objects of scorn and hatred. So for that reason, the information that's being circulated is also kind of contributing to this political identity where more and more gays and lesbians are comfortable coming out. They realize that there's strength in numbers, at least in neighborhoods like Greenwich Village. And so you begin to see the formation of political organizations, basically from about 1959 through 1969, under the banner Homophile. So now I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about them. And one reason that they're not super important to my project is that women's homophile organizations in particular are very anti-lesbian bar. So, and one of the reasons for that is because of what is branding the lesbian bar. And this is kind of key to the information that's coming out. The way that you can tell a lesbian bar is because of the kind of dress that the customers are putting on. The kind of sartorial style of lesbianism in the 1950s and the 1960s is a kind of butch femme aesthetic. So, and initially, just to kind of historicize, this butch aesthetic, which includes, like jumpsuits, oftentimes slacks are, sort of key, especially to, obviously I'm talking about butches here, not wearing makeup, not putting pounds and pounds and pounds of Aquanet in your hair, which is kind of common in the 40s and 50s. And in some ways, this grows out of working class occupations in the 1930s and especially in the 1940s around sort of wartime mobilization. The surprising thing about butch styles in the 1960s is how very similar they look to Rosie the Riveter styles in the 1940s. Very, very similar. I think that there's a kind of direct genealogy between these two styles. The difference is that Rosie the Riveter is presumably heterosexual. She's very patriotic. She represents a vital effort for the Second World War. And butch lesbians are objects of scorn. They should be locked up. They're subject to harassment by the police. If their families so wish, they can have them impounded in insane asylums. Things have obviously changed between the 1940s and 1960s. And this is, in part because women are sort of being re-domesticated, pushed back into the kitchen, so to speak, and discouraged from taking jobs outside of the home. So all of a sudden, butches are more visible than ever. And not only that, but they represent this kind of threat to the sexual order because they are very explicitly lesbians in the same way that Rosie the Riveter was very implicitly heterosexual. Just because butch femme styles are sort of the dominant styles in the 1950s and 1960s does not mean that all lesbians are embracing them. And in fact, one of the most negative perspectives that you get is from Mary Jane Meeker herself. So, in describing the bar scene, let me see. She talks about the butches that go into bars and the way that they are sort of creating a bad name for middle-class lesbians who are a little bit more conventionally sort of gender normative. This is her sort of context for this. She says, in the eyes of the mother of a teenage daughter, blue jeans and flannel shirts are just part of the high school girl's fad. A parallel feminine inclination in the son of the family is a worrisome symptom of a morbid disorder. A woman today is free to enter almost any profession she chooses, from engineering to medicine to the Marine Corps, with little speculation from others as to her normality or femininity. This is a big assumption on Mary Jane Meeker's part, and in fact, it's something that's contradicted by a lot of the other sources in the 1950s. The war years resulted in the final emancipation of women, but male designers, decorators, hairdressers, ballet dancers, artists, and nurses continually find their lines of work maligned by innuendos. The female homosexual who cares to be discreet knows little restriction in her personality, appearance, or choice of a profession. Her presence in a business establishment, in a restaurant, along the boulevard, or at a party is inconspicuous. If her hair is cut ear length, it is a new style. If she walks with giant strides and stands with legs spread and arms akimbo, she is forceful, aggressive, and probably a good golfer. She can wear slacks and shirts virtually anywhere. If her voice is pitched differently than most women's, she is the sultry type. So in some ways, Meeker's suggestion is that middle-class lesbians, professional lesbians, are sort of hiding in plain sight. The lesbians who she reserves most of her enmity for are actually butches. And this is her description of the butch, which is, for Mary Jane Meeker, most associated with lesbian bars. And she says, the butch is the caricature of the she-man. Tough, trousered, and tart, she lives the uncertain life of the transvestite. Sometimes she is inconspicuous in society, her masquerade unknown to or ignored by her employer and her neighbors. She may or may not have a girl. She comes and goes innocuously, asking of society little more than that she be allowed to wear that male clothing, which gives her some sort of strange solace. So in some ways, even Mary Jane Meeker, another lesbian, is using the same pathological language to describe butch lesbians. She is the venial transvestite, the benign butch, and the exception to the rule. More often, the butch makes herself conspicuous and chooses a society in which it is safe to do so. When she finds one of the many bohemian areas of big city, areas like Greenwich Village, she happily sets about the business of exhibiting herself with rapt abandon. If she works, but she probably won't if she can avoid it, she often finds employment in a nightclub or cafe that caters to homosexuals and people curious to see them. Ideally, she is kept by another stereotyped lesbian, the femme. Then she goes on to describe the femme. Her biggest problem with the butch is that they make themselves conspicuous, and then her other big problem with the butch, and this is something that is sort of repeated throughout in her nonfiction books about lesbian life, is that they're lazy and they don't want to work. This doesn't really take into account that a lot of butches are having trouble finding employment at the time. And in fact, a lot of the butches are working in lesbian bars as bartenders because it's one of the few places they can be butches. In many instances, they work in sex work. For many butch femme lesbians in the 1950s and 1960s, sex work with men is a kind of easy way to make a buck. Bouncers in lesbian bars at the time have their hands full keeping Johns out of the bars. And in fact, Mary Jane Meeker, sort of differentiates between good bars and bad bars as being bars where there are lots of Johns are sort of the bad bars, and bars where the bouncers are vigilant about keeping the Johns out are good bars. So you see this kind of class dynamic introduced into this butch femme bar scene. At the same time, butches are a form of branding. Joan Nessel, who you read, talks about looking for butches in a very active kind of way. This is because she knows if she sees a butch going into a bar, going into a particular space, that it's a safe space and that there are other lesbians there. So it's a place to find friends, potential romantic partners, potential enemies, which you're also going to find. All of these sort of aspects of butch signifying are important not just in terms of signaling same-sex desire, but they sort of brand lesbian bars. And this sort of brings me to my final point about the lesbian market anyway, which is that lesbian bars are probably the most distinctive bars in Greenwich Village in the 1950s and 1960s. That is to say, they're the most distinctively gay. My project is actually about gay economies in a larger context, and I have a chapter about lesbian bars that this talk is kind of reduced from. But in my other chapters, I discuss where gay men are congregating, and their most popular spots in the 50s and 60s is not actually the Village. It's actually the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side and Midtown Manhattan, which is home to a lot of men's bars. In the 1950s and 1960s in New York City, a lot of bars are gender segregated. Now New York has not yet protested at McSorley's Ale House to get them integrated. And so if a bar owner decides that it's a men's only bar, then women can't enter them. So in many cases, this does not indicate that it's a gay bar, but it means that it's an easy place for men to meet one another. And as long as they're not overly conspicuous, it's a place where they can kind of congregate, socialize, pick one another up if possible. And so we have lots of descriptions of like the men's bar at the Plaza Hotel being one of the major sort of gay hangouts in the 1950s and 1960s. There are a number of bars on the Upper East Side and Upper West Side where gay men are hanging out. But they are not conspicuous. Oftentimes they're referred to as the sweater set. They wear fuzzy sweaters and ties. You know, I watch Mad Men and I imagine that these sort of all-male soirees in Mad Men look a lot like what the gay bars would have looked like. You know, it's probably not, you wouldn't notice the gay male cruising unless you know what you're looking for. Lesbian bars are very visibly conspicuous. And in the 1950s, they're still home to a number of floor shows. You know, we usually associate drag with sort of female impersonation. So we usually think about gay male culture. But in fact, drag is a really important component of lesbian entertainment in the 1940s and 1950s. And this, you know, this grows out of a longer tradition that, you know, in some ways originates in New York City in the 1920s. In the jazz and blues scene in Harlem. Probably the most famous male impersonator today is Gladys Bentley, who was a performer in the 20s and 30s around the country, but who got her start in Harlem. In the 1940s and 1950s, you don't see as many sort of, you know, male impersonator shows as you see in this other period, but it's still an important feature of lesbian bar life. One of the most popular lesbian bars in the early 1950s is the Club 82, and their in-house performer is a woman named Blackie Dennis, who often performs a kind of tomboy routine. And you know, she appears in sort of short Knickerbocker-style pants, sort of driving cap. She sort of cultivates this boyish persona, and she's sort of the marquee headliner for a number of years at the Club 82. Well, by the end of the 1950s, this Butch sort of male impersonation sort of entertainment begins to fall out of favor. And in fact, by the 1960s, the Club 82 is home to the largest drag show, female impersonation drag show in the city. So in some ways, a lot of these drag spaces, these Butch drag spaces are taken over by gay male culture. You know, this sort of signals the end of, in some ways, Butch femme bar culture being sort of the institutional center of lesbian life. And part of this is because of people like Mary Jane Meeker, because of a number of lesbians, people like Audre Lorde, who identify as Kai, basically is neither butch nor femme, something that's in between. So the younger generation is increasingly moving away from these butch femme roles. And the other important reason is the emergence of the feminist movement, which rejects butch femme roles as a kind of role-playing of sort of heterosexual power dynamic. So you see a lot of stuff written about how butch femme lesbians are just kind of repeating the stereotypes that exist between men and women. So by the late 1960s, when Stonewall breaks out, this butch femme bar scene is basically a vestige of what it was before. And by the end of the 1960s, Greenwich Village has become much more associated with gay male life. And lesbian spaces become increasingly separate, increasingly distinct. So I'll leave you with a final story. One of the most popular bars in the late 60s and early 70s is a bar called Cookies. And Cookies is kind of an unusual bar because it's actually run by a lesbian or somebody who seems like a lesbian to most of the clientele. So you begin to see kind of lesbian entrepreneurship. A lot of consciousness-raising groups are held within these bars, so they become important political spaces. But at the same time, Cookie is charging more than most bar owners for the price of drinks. She's charging a lot of cover charges. And she's a kind of a little bit of a tough manager. So she is kind of famous for walking around the room and sticking her fingers in people's glasses. And when they're empty, she's saying, "Can I fill your glass? Can I fill your glass?" You know, basically trying to hawk drinks. So, you know, she's obviously, she's not been trained in the customer service model that I was when I worked in retail. jail, which is, the customer is always right. In 1971, Lesbian Feminist Liberation stages a series of protests about outside cookies, where they basically describe cookie in the same way that the owners of the Stonewall are described, as exploitative, as sort of mobbed up, although the evidence for this is kind of scanty, as not being concerned with the politics of gay and lesbian feminist liberation. So in some ways you see a new phase of lesbian sociability opening up in the 1970s that looks radically different than what came before. So this kind of wraps up my talk, but there was a lot more that I could have said. Sarah took a big risk because I'm notoriously long-winded, but I feel like I'm probably at about time. So I just want to open this up to questions. There are a lot of things that have been unsaid, and maybe a lot of questions that you have about some of the readings. So, from what I understand, it's not the same as it was in the 1950s or the 1960s. But I know that there has been, especially with youth, Greenwich Village is a very different place than it was in the 50s and 60s. It was much more sort of run down. The infrastructure was crumbling. The property values certainly weren't as astronomical. But it's still this site where youth from all over the city and all over the region gather because it's a safe space. And so most of the altercations that occur between police and lesbians are oftentimes lesbians who are coming from the outer boroughs or coming from New Jersey, places like Newark. And in many cases, they're being harassed for just being on the street after a certain time, or being too near a squad car whenever somebody complains about the noise on the street. So the dynamic of harassment is very different. I feel like it's much more about class, and to some extent, it's also about race as well. So there was the case of Sakia Gunn, and I think this was in 2003, so it was many years ago now. But she was, I believe, assaulted on the street, and she ended up stabbing a man. And it's sounded like she was in some ways trying to defend herself, and I think she ended up going to jail. So in some ways, things have not changed just because of Stonewall. In terms of police harassment and sort of safety issues on the street, but it's a different kind of dynamic now. So. I don't, because I don't do much research in biology. I do know, from my own perspective, I'm sort of a gay man. Well, obviously I'm a gay man. My own perspective is that, and I grew up in a place that was not unlike the places that are described here. I grew up in a very small town in West Texas. And I'm sorry to be so self-referential in giving this answer, but I don't think I heard the word homosexuality until I was like 11 or 12. By that point I was actually hearing epithets. And I was a little bit of a sort of artsy kid is what my parents would probably describe me as, but my dad was a music teacher, so I didn't have a whole lot of pressure to be this big butch thing. But when I started hearing these terms, which is basically a confrontation with culture, in some ways, I started having a language to think about who I was and to sort of explain to myself why it was I wasn't obsessed with girls the way that all of my sort of male friends were at the same time. So culture is really important in terms of shaping your sense of self. Regardless of whether you're born that way or you're not born that way or you're born both ways, I think a culture that affirms you or a culture that rejects you is profoundly important in terms of shaping how you see yourself and how you see the world and how you forge relationships with other people as well. And I have a lot of friends who are still closeted and who still are, live ostensibly heterosexual lives. Who still live in West Texas, and their cultural context is very different from mine. So I would describe them as gay because they have gay desires and they would not, and that is a cultural difference. But as far as the biology of the subject, it's way above my pay grade. So, well, I've never heard anything about children being exploited at the Stonewall. Although I know there are a lot of underage kids that went to the Stonewall pretty frequently, and reported that that was a place where you basically didn't have to show much of an ID. And this is also a time where there's not these sophisticated IDs, so it's easy to manufacture fake IDs. But I've done a lot of research on the Stonewall Bar, and one of the questions I had is, I don't necessarily see it as a starting point, but it is definitely like an important domino that falls. And I think what comes out of Stonewall is undeniable. Gay life is very, very, very different after June 1969 than it was before that period. And I think the powder keg or like tea kettle metaphor is probably a good one to describe Stonewall. Stonewall isn't the event, it's like the whistle. But I've done a lot of thinking about Stonewall because I did a lot of, early on when I did this project, I did a lot of research on organized crime in New York City. And organized crime are very important entrepreneurs. This isn't something I had a whole lot of time to talk about, but one of the reasons why Greenwich Village, in addition to its bohemianism, is the site of so many LGBT bars is because the supply is there. And this is because Greenwich Village at the time is kind of under the control of the Genovese organization. And the Stonewall Bar was owned by one of the Genovese affiliates, a guy named Tony Laria. And so a lot of this research has been done by Martin Duberman and David Carter. They have some great books, both of which are called Stonewall. I do have a description of the Stonewall Bar, but I will say I don't think that it was typical based on my research of other bars. It's the place where the mafia is the most present, and this is something that is talked about both before and after the Stonewall raid itself. But it seems like the mafia is more visibly present. But it's also a place where a lot of things go on that might raise the attention of the police. For one thing, they're letting in underage drinkers. For another thing, there seems to be a blackmail ring being run out of Stonewall. And upper and middle class men, the rumor is who are working on Wall Street are being shaken down for stock tips. So, and this is at a time where organized crime is sort of moving away from labor racketeering and loan sharking and all that stuff, and they're moving into stock manipulation. That is one reason. That's sort of the main reason that is given, is that there's money laundering and other kinds of crimes taking place at the Stonewall, and so that's why it's raided by the Seymour Pine and the police force from downtown. So, and the local precinct was not involved in the Stonewall raid because they were paid off by the mafia. Gay people sort of got caught in the crossfire. So you have your suppliers on the one hand, who are exploiting you, but you're sort of grateful that they're there. These are the mafia, and then you have your police who are sort of oppressing you. And after Stonewall, what you get is kind of a community that turns against both the supplier and the police. So there's always been a lot of dishing back to the police. There's always been a lot of sort of talk back, although it's never a kind of organized resistance. But there's never been a whole lot of talk about the mafia being in gay bars. I mean, it's something that people whisper about, and it's something that surfaces in gay bar guides, but it's not something that people are complaining about or organizing around. Well, after Stonewall, a lot of the stuff that's distributed, and in a lot of cases by local gay business owners, people like Craig Rodwell, who owns the gay bookstore down in the neighborhood, all their stuff is like, get the mafia out of gay bars. So it's all kind of anti-mafia activism as much as it is anti-police activism. And probably in some ways it's more anti-mafia. But the Stonewall was a kind of a unique bar because it allowed dancing. And I'll read you the description of the Stonewall Bar from a bar guide that's published in 1968. This is published about a year and a half before the raid, and it says, one of the most active spots in town currently, very crowded on weekends, casual. It continues operating amid persistent rumors of closing, caters to a younger crowd who seem to spend all their time perfecting their dancing. Observers note that go-go boys installed on platforms have failed to attract the dwindling crowds. The following news item was reported in the March 1968 Mattachine, New York newsletter and is presented here in condensed form. The Mattachine Society, Inc. of New York was instrumental in aiding DA Frank Hogan's office with information that led to the arrests of a number of blackmailers. So, you know, you have this description of gay rights organizations collaborating with the police against the mafia in the Stonewall, you know, a year and a half before you see any kind of protest. Edward F.P. Murphy, an ex-convict who is alleged to have been the head of the National Ring, which recently was active in extorting money from homosexuals, has served prison terms for larceny and for carrying deadly weapons, and was arrested for impersonating an officer and for extortion under federal indictment on extortion charges, permitted to plead guilty, and received a 5-year probation. On a number of indictments in the state courts, Murphy pleaded guilty on May 16, 1966. Sentencing has been postponed 6 times. He could get up to 15 years in prison as a second-time offender on the robbery charge alone. MSNY has also been informed that Murphy has an interest in the Stonewall, a club on Christopher Street, and several other gay clubs in New York. We caution our readers never to use your real name when cruising, never to give your address to a questionable bar or club, and remember that trick or hustler you've just picked up may be working for the management. We urge you, if you've been intimidated or blackmailed in the past, to report it to the DA's office or to MSNY. So who knows that gay people have actually not collaborated with the investigation that ultimately led to the Stonewall raid. So one of the reasons why the Stonewall is very popular is because they allow dancing. And this is also something that's against the rules. You still can't dance in a bar unless there's a cabaret license. And Stonewall didn't have a cabaret license. So it's not super common. People definitely recognize couples. And you know, Butch femme relationships are built around couples. And these are couples that are very monogamous. And very, well, they're supposed to be anyway. They're very jealously guarded. And a lot of relationships are like that. And they tend to be more so among lesbians than among gay men. But you do see these kind of informal wedding celebrations that take place in gay bars. There are lots of sort of family photos, family photo types. That are depictions of sort of gay weddings. A lot of these take places in homes. So it's not something that's typical, but it's also not totally unusual or unheard of at the time. So you know, this idea that gay marriage is a kind of new movement is not entirely true. It may not have been the primary focus of gay liberation in 1969. I mean, you have to realize they're trying to get the mafia out of their bars. They're not really worried about getting married, which is kind of a step away. But already people are thinking about marriage. You know, I think the first couple to apply for a marriage license is in 1971 in Minnesota. So, although I could be wrong about that because I don't research that. But you know, it is something that takes place in gay bars, and it does become a place to kind of show off your relationships. And you know, it's a place where people talk about the other clients being there as being a kind of family. So, you know, weddings and other kinds of rituals of commitment are something that I would think would be somewhat commonplace. So, as far as I know, HIV rates are climbing again, although I think the population where they're climbing the most rapidly are actually heterosexual women. I know that it is still an issue, although it's not as visible as it once was. Since the introduction of antiretrovirals in 1994. But you know, obviously there are still safer sex campaigns and that kind of thing to address the rise of HIV and AIDS. And honestly, where it's most frightening, and this is something that scares, I'm 32, this is something that scares people in my generation, because we grew up with the kind of safer sex drills. We knew about how to protect ourselves, and we had lots of information about the disease itself. And what I'm finding with my students who are roughly between 18 and 22 is that they've never had sex education. They don't know anything about HIV. They don't really have any idea of how it's spread. Their idea about HIV is that it's not really a real disease because it's not visibly manifested. And so there's almost a flippant attitude with people who are a little bit younger than my cohort. And you know, I think this is just because there hasn't been a whole lot of education around that issue. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.